The great one, Peter Maher. Nobody more excited that Rod Stewart will be in town. I have no idea of the plans of the former voice of the Edmonton Oilers, Rod Phillips, but I do know that Rod Stewart is coming to town, and nobody more excited than our next guest, Peter Maher. I buggered that one up, didn't I?
Indeed so. That's going to be a real big night on August the 17th in the Scotiabank Saddledome. Looking forward to it. I think it'll be the 18th concert I've seen Rod in.
I was just going to ask you how many have you, and you've seen them all in Calgary, right? Like you've seen, since you've come to Calgary, you haven't missed a Rod Stewart show in Calgary?
No, there were a couple in Calgary I missed because it was on the road with the Flames at the time those concerts were held. But
Gotcha.
Other than that, all the ones that he had here I saw. And I believe this is going to be his 15th appearance in the Saddledome.
Wow.
And no other performer has had more concerts in the Saddledome than Rod Stewart. And the very first time I saw him was the very first time he was here, which was back in 1983, I believe, or 84. When the Saddledome, soon after the Saddledome had opened, and that's when I became a big Rod Stewart fan. My son Jeff and my daughter Tricia took me to got tickets for Nancy and I to go to the concert. We went, and that's when I became a Rod Stewart fan. And other times I've seen him on the road, just a couple of times, just by chance. The Flames happened to be in the city the night before a game, and he had a concert. One of them was in Montreal, another one was in Carolina. So sometimes it was the luck of the draw. Other times there was some good planning made to get there.
Pete, do we know what catalog he's working out of for this tour?
What she's working out of what again, Rod? Sorry.
Which catalog of songs? Which do we know what he's singing on this tour?
Only the hits.
Oh, just hits, eh?
Just the hits. Yep, just the hits.
Right.
So,
all right.
I'm looking forward to that.
Not like you're counting down the days or anything.
No, but I've got it marked on the calendar.
Well, Pete, we haven't talked.
He was in Prince Edward Island. I don't know, maybe 5 or 6, 7, 8 years ago, and he was an outdoor show there. And I had some friends of mine, being from the Maritimes, wondering if I was going to go to that concert. And I decided, no, I'm not going to. I'd already made my trip down the east that year. Yeah. And as it turned out, it was raining that day. So I was glad I wasn't there, because I probably wouldn't have been protected from all the rain. But anyway, that's a little sidelight. So it would have been 20 times if I'd have gone there then.
Well, who knows how many? We don't know how many it's going to end up yet, Pete, because neither of you guys are done.
Yep.
Boy, it's been a while, almost a month since you and I have talked on this program. We turned you over to the careful hands of Danny Auston a couple of weeks ago.
And Tammy Tempty as well was on that day.
That's right. That's right. So you were
taking. She brought up the Maritimes that day, so that's how it got referred to on that particular occasion.
a lot has transpired, but let's stick with the two general managers, and we'll go chronologically, I suppose, and go backwards. Let's start with today. And you heard me talk about it off the top. Brad Treliving, the new general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he's a friend of mine. I really like Brad. I think it's a daunting task whenever you take over that team. What do you make of the news today?
I think it's great for Brad. I mean, I think he did a really good job here, considering some of the circumstances that he had to deal with, and now that he's landed on his feet and back in the general manager's chair in Toronto, it's outstanding. I don't know Brad nearly as well as you. I've got to know him, Rod, but when I did see him, be around him, he was always engaging, always helpful. If I needed anything, just ask him, and he would make it work. And if I needed anything and that type of thing. So, and looking at the work that he did, I thought he did a very good job in his 9 years that he was GM of this Flame hockey team. And, it was really interesting. There was some speculation of him going to Toronto way back in January, which was, really interesting, because at that time, Kyle Dubas was still looked like firmly in the chair in Toronto, and Brad firmly in the chair with the Flames. But things do change sometimes in a hurry. And in this particular case, Kyle Dubas is out in Toronto, and Brad is out in Calgary, but now he's in Toronto. So I think he's going to do a wonderful job. And I think one of the key reasons that he got the job was his work ethic, and some of the history that he's had in Arizona and in Calgary and Arizona, where he's assistant general manager. And also, I think the fact that he's worked in a Canadian market was a big plus getting Toronto, because he knows at least somewhat what it's like working in a Canadian market, although I think he'll find Toronto's market a little bit tougher from a public standpoint than he experienced here in Calgary. But I'm sure that he'll get through that all right without any real major problems. He's that type of person.
There's a couple of things about him that intrigue me with this particular job, and one is that they're not unlike Calgary in the sense that they have some decisions to make and some contracts, not necessarily on the front burner, but we know now that the front burner's been moved up quite, by a year. You can't really wait on things. Pete, he's a little bit of a, would you call him, the old school term was riverboat gambler. And I know the Flames tend to be risk adverse. They don't like to take a lot of risks, but Brad would take risks, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he would. And so it's going to be real interesting. And I think the very first case he has to deal with is with Matthews. His contract, he can sign a new contract by July 1. And if he decides that he doesn't want to sign a contract there, they've got to move him. And they've got to move him, fairly quick and get a great return for him. So that, to me, is the number one decision. Well, I guess the number one decision really he has to make is he's going to make a coaching change with the Maple Leafs. That situation's been up in the air ever since Kyle Dubas left. In fact, was up in the air even before he left. So I think that's the first decision he'll have to make. And I think he has to do that relatively quick, because then he has to turn his attention to Auston Matthews and see if he can get him signed to a contract extension. That'll make him a Leaf for a long, long time. Otherwise, he has to move him. Otherwise, he'll lose him and get nothing for him. And as you mentioned, they've got those top four guys, all very solid hockey players, but it eats up about half of their payroll. And so if he's going to give Matthews a raise, it's not going to be into effect for the upcoming season, but it's going to come up into effect for future seasons down the road. So, yeah, that's a real major hurdle that he's going to have to deal with right away with the agent for Matthews, and sit down and have a chat with him as well.
Isn't it interesting in a way, Peter, that it's going to be kind of intriguing to watch Brad and the decisions that he makes just on the coach and Matthews? He inherited Bob Hartley. He kept Bob Hartley, right? Now, eventually he moved on, but he could have taken that opportunity and moved on from Bob Hartley when he took over, but he didn't. And he's got that same decision to make now. I wonder how that might influence, or if it influences. And the other one is just a year ago is Johnny Gaudreau walking away. A lot of people are, very, I suppose, critical of that decision. I think we all know why it happened. The intent, the heart was there, but this is a business. I wonder how cold and calculated he will be with Matthews.
And certainly he's going to have a different approach to it than having gone through that experience last year with Johnny Gaudreau. And he was pretty well shocked the night before that he wouldn't sign on with the Flames and decided he was going to become a free agent. And I think he was shocked by that, because he was pretty certain that Johnny was going to re-sign here with the Flames. In fact, which we'll get to shortly, when Craig Conroy announced as general manager of the Flames, one of the first things he said is, we're not going to experience another Johnny Gaudreau situation as we did here last year. So, and that, of course, is going to be firmly on the mind of Brad as he goes about his business now in Toronto. And the other thing is, I'm sure that Matthews is going to know who's going to be coach of the team. That's going to be all part and parcel of trying to sit down and get him to negotiate a contract extension. So these are decisions that can't wait for forever to be handled. So he's going to keep the same coach, then, well, that's fine. You go ahead with that. And but if you're thinking of bringing in somebody else, then you're pretty much going to have to tell Matthews who that guy is before he can make a decision, because I'm sure that is going to be something that will weigh on his decision as to whether to stay in Toronto or consider moving on to another location. Many people say that since he's from Arizona that he'll end up going there, but I'm sure he wants to win a Stanley Cup, and the chances of Arizona winning a Stanley Cup in the near future are pretty much null and void. And in fact, it may be null and void, period, because they could be moving away from the Phoenix, Arizona area in the near future. So,
sure.
But there's lots of other teams that I'm sure will have an interest in Matthews if he becomes available.
Well, and let's be perfectly honest, a lot of people speculated that Johnny Gaudreau would end up with the New Jersey Devils or the Philadelphia Flyers, because that's where he was from. But as we know, that didn't happen. So sometimes those lines don't get drawn quite as straight as we think they do.
Well, the situation, though, in Philadelphia was they didn't have any room under the cap to sign him.
Nope.
But then the second alternative would have been New Jersey. But they had the money, and it didn't appear as though they made a very much of an effort to get him either. So,
Yep.
so you just never know about these things. You're right. Yeah.
Pete, we talked about this 6 weeks ago when Brad walked away, and he did. He was offered a contract extension. He didn't take it. You mentioned it's kind of the first time that's ever happened, with the Flames. How different, and I know it's been a while since you worked there, but you've still got ties there. How different is working for MLSE as opposed to working for CSEC, do you think? Do you think that Brad's going to notice a difference?
Well, if you're reading some of the comments that Kyle Dubas made, and they're reading a bit in between the lines on that, when he was in that GM position, there seemed to be he wanted the structure changed there. That there were too many scenarios you had to go through in order for a decision to be made. And when you look back at that, whether I'm sure Brad saw those comments or heard those comments, and brought those up with Shanahan when he was talking to him about the job. But apparently the way things kind of go is that the GM comes up with, a decision to make a trade or sign or whatever, then it has to go through Shanahan. Shanahan has to take it to the owners, and there's three separate groups there. There's Rogers owns part of that, Bell owns part of that, and then there's another group that has another small share in it. And apparently all of that has to be approved by these people before some of these things can become law, if you will. And I know Dubas seemed to indicate he didn't like that. And that was one of the things he wanted to change if he was going to stay there. So I'm sure that was addressed in the meetings that Brad Treliving had with Shanahan. But whether or not any of that gets changed, I don't know. When you look at CSEC, I'm sure that there are no major decisions that are made within the Flames that are not have to go through ownership of the team.
Sure.
I mean, I'm sure last year when Daryl Sutter got his 2-year contract extension, that ultimately he won't work now, but he'll get paid. I'm sure that had to be approved by Murray Edwards, the premier owner of the Flames. And I'm sure that any other major deals have to go through him as well, and the other owners on the team. It's interesting. It goes back to a couple of years ago when Brad was GM at the trade deadline. There was I don't know how factual it was because I wasn't there, but I did hear about it, that there was a trade in the works with Minnesota, I believe, for Jason Zucker coming to the Flames. And Brad couldn't get a hold of Murray Edwards to approve of that trade before the trade deadline, so the trade didn't go through. So I'm sure he had that experience right there where his hands were tied on a deal that he wanted to make, and he would take that into consideration when he's talking with the Maple Leafs. So, when you're spending the kind of money you spend on contracts for hockey players and coaches and that in this day and age in the NHL, you pretty much have to go through ownership to get their approval on these things. And these owners are involved in a whole lot of other business aspects because they've got a lot of money, and the reason they have a lot of money is because they work hard and they make good deals. So sometimes they are not able to find within a couple of seconds when you need an answer. So that will be interesting to see how that unfolds as time goes on in Toronto. That
trade, by the way, or that proposed trade, was Mike Russo from The Athletic wrote about it here this past year. So that one kind of came to light. One last one, Pete, and then we got to move to the locals because, again, big story there too. But it's easy to hate on the Maple Leafs being a Western Canadian. It's easy to get mad at, the coverage on, Sportsnet and TSN and everything. And I get that. And I'm not trying to curry anybody's favor or change anybody's mind. But you said it before, Pete, like Brad saw what was going on with Kyle Dubas. He knows what a hotbed market it is. What's the attraction for a hockey person to take a job there? Why bother? Why be part of this monstrous organism that seems so difficult to tame? What's the allure of leading that team?
Well, to me, Rob, the thing is the challenge of it. And if you end up having success with that challenge, you're going to be a hero in Toronto forever. Yeah. Now, the Maple Leafs haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1967. Right. And so if you can go in there as a general manager or as a coach and get that team to perform to a point where they go the full route and win a Stanley Cup, I mean, you can live in Toronto and never have to buy a meal again. It's that kind of situation. I mean, it's a situation in Calgary is similar, but not as widespread as Toronto. I mean, it's massive there. What kind of appreciation you can get if you have a championship team, like the Raptors and the Blue Jays when they were winning, going back a few decades. And then the Raptors, of course, a few years ago. I mean, those guys are all still being cherished and bowed upon in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
So and those teams are not the big team in Toronto. The Maple Leafs have always been Toronto's biggest team, and they've gone so long without winning. You can just imagine what kind of an explosion it would be if they won the cup. I mean, my granddaughter lives in Toronto, and the night they won that first round playoff series this year, she was at home and she could hear the horns honking out in the street all night as the people were celebrating one series win. So you can imagine if you win a Stanley Cup, and if you're the general manager of that team, say Brad Treliving, then there's great appreciation for that, and I think that's the challenge of being a general manager, a coach, or even a player in Toronto. The other side of that is when you don't have success, then they come on you very, very hard. I think even more so in Toronto than they would here in Calgary, because they're just massive with the media attention you get there when you're winning or losing.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's that whole idea of if you can do it, they'll build monuments to you.
But look at Doug Gilmour. He played here for the Flames. He scored 2 goals the night the Flames won the Stanley Cup, and the game-winning goal included in that. And, he was a big star here. He goes to Toronto, and he becomes 4 times the star that he was in Calgary. So, that's just an example of a player, what the difference can make. Yeah, which is something we can touch on it a little bit here, because it's not the first time that a Flame general manager has gone from here to Toronto.
No, and that name Gilmour actually is kind of part of that too. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't jump in, because you and I have not had a chance to speak. I go all the way back to when his playing career was winding down. It always felt like it was a fait accompli that Craig Conroy would go from playing to the broadcast booth, and he'd be the greatest. He'd be the Shaquille O'Neal or the Charles Barkley of hockey. He was just, that was the destiny that we all had preordained for Craig Conroy, but he chose to go a different path, Pete. And, he was named the general manager of the Calgary Flames last week. Somebody joked to me that he found out on the Friday before the long weekend, and it must have been the most excruciating 3 days of his life because he couldn't tell anybody. But I'm so happy for him. We know him really well. We got to know him as a player and as a manager. It was the right pick all along, but just a thought on Craig getting that job.
Well, I think the Flames did the right thing by talking to a whole lot of people with regard to that job, both internally and externally. As I mentioned when we were on about a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I mentioned it was very important for them to talk to as many people outside of the organization and get their feel on the Flames before they make a final decision. And they went through all of that at pace. Don Maloney, along with John Bean, the president CEO of the Flames, going through that. And the fact that in the end they determined that Craig Conroy was the man for that job tells you that they are the only 2 people that could have known what kind of work Craig Conroy was doing. We all know about his characteristics being so outstanding, a great personable guy, a good PR guy, a hardworking guy, but only the people behind the scenes know what an assistant general manager has been doing. And Maloney and Bean obviously saw a lot of that with Craig and felt he was the guy for the job. So, and that tells you how much work he's done behind the scenes, because when there's a trade, when there's a free agent signing, when there's a drafting, the guy that's in the forefront is the general manager. There's a lot of work being done underneath the general manager in the front office, but the people that are involved there don't get any public notice for that. It only is an internal thing. So that tells me that those people felt Craig was the guy for the job, and I felt all along that he was the guy for the job without knowing, exactly the inner workings that he had provided for them in the 9 years he was in that chair. I'll never forget, he had retired as a player after playing 1,000 games. And after his first game, and then of course he was hired on as management with the Flames by the late Ken King. And I never forget talking to him after the first game that he went to while he was in a managerial position with the Flames. He said he gone in, talked to the coaches after the game, and he came out and he said, boy, this is a whole different experience than it was when I was a player. So he had his eyes open right away as to what it was like to be a manager, and when they go in doing their assessment of players and that sort of thing. So he's seen it all as a player, and then now he's seen an awful lot of it all from behind the scenes. And I think he'll do an outstanding job as general manager. And I think it was also a very good move to bring Dave Nonis in as an assistant general manager. He's got general managing experience in Vancouver and Toronto, and that vast knowledge certainly is going to be helpful to help guide Craig along with his job. And as I was saying earlier, the big thing that I took out of his first news conference and several other interviews that he's done since then is that they're not going to make the same mistake that they made with Johnny Gaudreau and not get something for him. Not going to lose a player and not get something for him. So right now, I think his big job is finding a coach. And then he's got to sit down with those 7 Flame players, including Elias Lindholm and Michael Backlund and a few others there. Just sit down with them and find out whether or not they're willing to sign long-term with this team, because all of the 7 players that they have contracts are out at the end of this coming season. And they can't afford to let this one get through the cracks as they did with Johnny. And to me, if they can't get a deal done with him before the start of this season, then you got to move him right away. Some people would say, well, wait till the deadline. Maybe you can get something for them. The problem is, if you get to the deadline and the team is having a good year and a good position in standing and a chance of having a good run in the playoffs, and you start moving some of these players, and you kill the chemistry on the team. Yep. And so, it's got to be done now if that is the decision that they're going to make. So Craig's going to have his hands full, but I'm sure that he'll handle it very well. And, the interview process for the coach will be an interesting one, because as we all know, Craig's a very talkative guy. And if he's going to talk to 30 coaches, that's probably going to take up about 400 hours of his time to get all that sorted out.
And there's the famous story when they hired Glenn Gulletson that he went out to Vancouver and they did the grouse grind. They went for the run up the mountain.
That's right.
And that was,
I forgot about that.
Yeah. But to that end, Pete, and I do want to get back to the players because I want to ask you a specific question about those players, but to Craig Conroy, and I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a friend of his and I'm a little defensive about it. I thought a lot was made about him smiling and wanting it to be fun, and I thought it got painted in a way that wasn't fair necessarily to Craig, and I'm not trying to present him as some sort of devious mastermind or madman but the dog's got some bite. Like, he is, he's a very competitive guy. And, yes, he wants it to be fun, and yes, he wants it to be lighter, but not at the expense of winning.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, most people have only seen him on the ice playing hockey and when he was playing. And when you meet him, I mean, he's bubbly and he's upbeat and positive and all that sort of thing. But I've also seen him have some very down moments, and he has that edge to him. And I think that's going to be a necessary thing in a general manager's position. And I have no doubt that he will apply that when that is necessary. Publicly, maybe anytime you see him, it may all be kind of a bubbly type of situation and positive with him. That's just the character that he is. Yep. But when it comes to making decisions and handling people, I think you're going to see him have that edge to him that you and I have seen from him from time to time in different kind of situations when he was a player, and then not even when he had retired afterwards. And so I think that people portraying him being just a happy-go-lucky guy are not getting the true read on who Craig Conroy is.
Right. You mentioned the 7 players, Pete, and that's kind of hanging out there. One that he has specifically talked about is Elias Lindholm. I believe, and I apologize because we were talking about this on Monday, and I said, well, they got nobody else up the middle. My apologies. Nazem Kadri can play center. It does play center. But I do feel like you need to have a number 1 center, and that without Sean Monahan around here and without one of the young guys being that, I think it puts more emphasis on keeping Lindholm.
Yes, indeed. There's no question about that. He's a guy that he has to be the number 1 guy from that group of 7 players that you focus on and try to get him signed. And, the way he the way he departed. Of course, when he departed and all the other players departed, Daryl Sutter was still coach of the team, and I think there was a faction of the players there that were not happy being around Daryl as coach and that sort of thing. But of course, that's all been wiped out now, and so they've got a new GM and there's going to be a new coach, and I think that's going to be the important part. As I was saying earlier, I think they've got to hire the coach first before they can get a definitive conclusion with regard to Lindholm and some of those other guys that are in that situation, because they're not going to want to commit unless they know who the coach is and have a pretty good idea what type of coach he is and whether or not that it's somebody they can work with in a satisfactory manner. Now, not all, coaches and players don't get along 100%, but if there's a big situation where there's a huge void between the coach and the player, then, you've got to have somebody in there that the coach the player rather can respect. So I think, they have to, there's no harm in talking to those guys now, but I don't think you can get a final decision from any of them until you've got a head coach in place for this season. And so, to me, that has to happen, before July 1 for sure. It doesn't really have to happen before the draft, but it certainly has to happen fairly soon here. And I'm sure that's what Craig is focusing on this week for the most part, is getting in touch with the many coaching candidates that are out there to see if get a little bit of a read on them to get things started with regard to the process of getting a coach hired here.
How do you handicap it? And I'll say this by saying that, traditionally, if you get rid of a hard-ass coach, you usually bring in a player's coach. And I think the Flames have been guilty of going back and forth on that. Gerard Gallant is an interesting name, not one that I would have brought up myself, but because he's out there, I thought that was the problem with the Rangers, was that Gallant and his players this year kind of fell off the same page. So it's a little interesting for me to hear his name out there.
Yeah, Gerard Gallant, I've got all the respect in the world for Gerard. I know him personally. He's a Maritimer from Prince Edward Island. And, he got 2 100-point seasons with the Rangers, this past one and the one before that. Yep. And still they ended up firing him after getting eliminated from the first round of the playoffs this year, which was really kind of hard to fathom when you think he had 100-point seasons twice during the regular season, and the Rangers stepped in and let him go after they had their exit interviews with players. Management did, that is, and decided he wasn't the guy to be their coach. It was a little bit puzzling there. And, of course, he was let go very quickly also when he was coaching Florida. He was also let go rather quickly when he was coaching in Las Vegas. So I don't know what all the situations were there, but he's a guy that's got a pretty good coaching record in the regular season in the NHL. And he also coached Jonathan Huberdeau for a full season with the Florida Panthers. And, of course, Huberdeau is a player they have to get back on track this year when he starts out on this 8-year contract that pays him $10.5 million a year. So, that to me, that's why that might make him a candidate for the job. Now, Andrew Brunette, I think, was probably a guy that the Flames were considering as well. But he, of course, signed yesterday to a new coaching, getting a new coaching position in Nashville. And he's a guy that coached Huberdeau when he had that big 115-point season 2 years ago with the Florida Panthers. So, but Gerard Gallant, the fact that he's been around and he's had the success would make him a candidate for this job here with the Flames. And I'm sure that they'll interview him. Whether or not he ends up being the coach, be another thing. But, he certainly does have regular season credentials. Let's put it that way. Not so much in the playoffs, but does have regular season credentials. And, another name that popped into all this that kind of surprised me was Marc Savard, who was a player here with the Flames back in the early 2000s and a line mate with Jerome McGinley. And he's had some success coaching with Windsor in the Ontario Hockey League the last 2 seasons of junior play. Now, that's the only head coaching experience he's had. But his name coming up in there is a little bit of a surprise, although Greg Conroy knows him, obviously, and Jerome McGinley's name has been attached as a guy that at some point could be joining the Flames organization in a managerial position. So he would probably have some good things to say about Marc, who won a Stanley Cup, or at least was a member of the Boston Bruins when they won the Stanley Cup in 2011. Although he didn't play, he had some concussion issues that forced him to end his NHL career earlier than he would have liked. But that was a bit of a surprise name that comes up. He never coached as a head coach in professional hockey. He was assistant coach with the St. Louis Blues there for a couple of seasons, going back to 2017, 2018. So, but I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other people that they're going to be talking to with regard to this job, including, a bunch of people internally and externally. Now, they've got some very solid people internally that names have been popped up quite regularly here in the media and social media and elsewhere. And my only concern with regard to internally is I go back to the 2006-2007 season. Mm-hmm. It was the year after Darryl had stepped away from coaching the Flames and then was concentrating only on the general manager's position. He had been the GM and coach for a while there. So he appointed Jim Playfair as the head coach of the Flames for that season. And I thought Jim was an excellent, excellent coach. Yep. The problem that existed there was that when Darryl was the coach, Jim was the assistant or the associate coach. And when Darryl was bashing the players, it was Jim that had to come in and build them up again by patting them on the back and that type of deal. So then when Jim came in as the head coach of the team, he had to be, he wasn't as tough as Darryl, obviously, but he had to have a much tougher fiber when he was handling with the players. And a lot of the players were a little bit confused. They didn't know, who is this guy? He was a guy that really liked us last year, but this year he doesn't seem to so much like us. And so that created a real problem with the team. And unfortunately, Jim was let go as head coach of the team right after just 1 year. Right. As a head coach of the team. Then he was brought back in as an associate coach, and when Mike Keenan came in to be a coach of the team. So to me, you've got to be very, very careful if you're making an internal decision with regard to a coach, especially after you've had a hard line coach like Darryl, being the guy that was there previously. So, and Jim Playfair never got another chance to be a head coach again in the NHL. And I think he would have made a real good one.
I do too. Speaking of friends of the program and guys I really like, I think he was in the unenviable position of having to work for the former coach. Let's use Ryan Huska as an example. I would like to think it would be different for Ryan Huska if he got elevated into that position, but it's a fair question to ask, right? Because he'd be in the exact same position. Former American League coach for some of these guys, then the assistant, and now the head coach. And, that one, it really didn't work.
Yeah, unfortunately, it did. Jim had great success as a minor league, as you mentioned, and was very, very studious. There are some people were saying, some players are telling me that when Mike Keenan was the coach, it was Jim Playfair who was drawing up the strategies for all the games for the team. So
yes, no, I heard some of that too. But it does bring us one last one on this topic, and that's Mitch Love. And Mitch Love is in this really interesting position of being the it guy. And if the Flames had no coaching, vacancies this year, people would be talking about Mitch Love, right? That he reminds me of John Cooper and the way, because Cooper was in Syracuse when they hired Hartley, and he was kind of the it kid. And, I think there's some on the Flames organization that talked to Cooper and thought, maybe we ought to talk to this guy, but Feaster had already gone down that path. I feel like Mitch Love is kind of the it guy, not in the NHL right now.
Yeah, that's a different one. It's internal, but it's a little different than being an associate coach or a head coach with the team, as he's been dealing with all the young players that are in the system, and tremendous amount of success both years he was head coach. Stockton last year, and then this year when the team was here in Calgary as the Wranglers in the American Hockey League. So he's a real interesting candidate for that coaching job. And of course, Craig Conroy would have observed him very closely over his time with the American League team, and the success that he's had, and the way he handled players and all that sort of thing. So I'm sure he's going to get himself a pretty extensive interview for this job, as well as some of the other internal people that the Flames have. But he's a real interesting one. He's 38 years old, so he's a very young. The last time I was on the show a couple of weeks ago, I couldn't quite remember some of the other coaches' quick ages, and then of course it reminded me afterwards that Ryan Pike, I believe, came out with a mentioning that Greg Gilbert was around that same age when he was appointed coach of the Flames back in 2001, 2002. That's of course when they had the issue with Mark Savard. So that's just a whole bunch of little things there. But I think he's a worthy guy, no question. Mitch Love for this with this position. So,
around the league yesterday, we saw two of the positions that were filled. I have a lot of time for Barry Trotz, and I have a lot of time for the Nashville Predators organization, but that one felt a little odd to me that they kind of left John Hines hanging there and then brought in Andrew Brunette.
Yeah, to me, that should have been done much earlier to give John Hines an opportunity to look at some other coaching positions. Same with Sheldon Keith
exactly.
In Toronto. I mean, he's been sitting around waiting, and if he ends up losing that job, it's going to make be too late to get another job in the NHL for this coming season. But that was a little bit surprising because in reality, Barry Trotz isn't taking over as GM of that team in Nashville until July 1, although he's in the chair now because David Poyle is retiring at the end of June here. But so the decision making going forward is up to the guy who's in the general manager chair, and Trotz is definitely that. But I thought it left. He could have at least told Hines that he was considering making a change, and maybe allowed him to interview elsewhere. But I guess he looked at it another way, and Andrew Brunette came in and be the guy. As I mentioned earlier, he was the guy that I think the Flames had on their list to want to talk to, and they may have had talked to him before he got this job with Nashville. And then yesterday, the other coach getting the job is Spencer Carberry, coaching now the Washington Capitals after being an assistant coach in Toronto for a couple of seasons. And now there's 4 coaching vacancies that are open around the league. The Flames have theirs, and of course Anaheim, Columbus, and the New York Rangers. It's interesting. We've had in the last couple of days here, we've had some signings, those 2 coaches, and today the general manager in Toronto. And I'm just wondering if we might see a few more signings here in the next couple of days, because in the past, Gary Bettman, in his position as a commissioner of the NHL, has sent out notices to all teams in the league that he'd prefer that they didn't make any moves for coaches, management, while the Stanley Cup Finals are on, because he wants to have the Stanley Cup Finals be the total focus. Now, some teams have not followed through on that recommendation or suggestion, and have made announcements during the Stanley Cup Final, but I'm sure they try to get around it. So it might be interesting if we see some coaching decisions made here in the next couple of days before the Stanley Cup Finals get going. And it's surprising to me is how long the New York Rangers have been without a coach since they fired Gerard Gallant. I mean, that's been a long tenure now, but almost a month since that happened. And I'm just wondering, Peter Laviolette's name has been mentioned prominently with the Rangers, and he's also been mentioned here for the Flames. But I'm just wondering if in the Rangers situation, they're waiting to talk to Joel Quenneville. And Joel Quenneville can't go back into coaching. He has to get approval from Commissioner Bettman. And Commissioner Bettman has already said that he won't talk to Quenneville about that until after the Stanley Cup Finals are over. Now, that puzzles me a little bit as to why you would wait then. I'm sure Gary has an hour somewhere in there that he can meet with Quenneville and talk over the situation that saw him forced to resign as coach of the Florida Panthers going back to the start of the previous season. So 2 years ago, rather. And so I'm just wondering if that's not holding up some of these coaching positions that are out there. He certainly would be a strong candidate, giving his Stanley Cup winning experience and as a coaching background. And of course, if you tie him up, you want to connect him to the Flames. He and Lanny McDonald are great friends. I mean, they're real personal friends. And of course, Lanny's not in Flame management, but he's certainly around the scene as a great ambassador for the Flame hockey team. So I'm sure that if they were considering him, they'd be talking to Lanny about Joel Quenneville. They actually were traded together when I was broadcasting Maple Leaf games in Toronto. They got traded to the Colorado Avalanche on the 28th of December. And what led to that trade was that Daryl Sittler was the captain of the team, and Punch Imlach had just come in that season to be the new general manager of the team, replacing Jim Gregory. And Daryl and Punch didn't get along very well, but Daryl was the very first player. Daryl Sittler was the very first player in the history of the NHL to have a no-trade clause in his contract, and he refused to be traded by the Maple Leafs, even though he was fed up with Imlach and all that sort of thing. So Imlach couldn't trade Lanny, or certainly couldn't trade Daryl, so he traded his best friend Lanny and Joel Quenneville, who was a defenseman on that team, to the Colorado Rockies, and they went there with Don Cherry was coaching the Rockies. And I well remember that day there was a there was a Leaf game that night at Maple Leaf Gardens, and there was a big demonstration out in front of the building of fans out there and criticizing the Maple Leafs for trading Lanny McDonald. And it certainly got an awful lot of media attention in Toronto at that particular time. And then it was interesting, last November, Rob, when you were the MC of the Lanny McDonald night that we had at the Saddle Dome, I was sitting at the same table with Daryl Sittler. And I mentioned to Daryl about that, and he said, "Oh yeah, that was quite an experience with Punch on that particular occasion." Eventually, I got fed up with him and told him to trade me, and that's when he got traded to Philadelphia. But he said those times when he was at the Maple Leafs, when Harold Ballard was the owner, and then Harold had brought in Punch and Black, he said he could write about 10 books on what was transpiring behind the scenes during all that time. So anyway, another interesting little development there with Joel Quenneville and Lanny McDonald.
Yeah, but who would believe them now, Pete? Right? That's the thing. We know they happen, but they're almost unbelievable.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So.
To the matters at hand, at least with the remaining two teams, it seems like the Florida Panthers have put a little emphasis into just get in. Like now, just get in, right? Yeah,
people have been, teams have been saying that for a while. The coaches or management, just get into the playoffs. Anything can happen. And I wasn't one that really bought into that. Like I was saying, okay, sure, it's great to make the playoffs, but the chances of you winning a Stanley Cup, which is what it's all about, when you just get in, are not very strong. Although there's some exceptions, like Daryl Sutter when he coached Los Angeles in 2012, when they finished the last qualifying team in the playoffs, and then ultimately went on to win the Stanley Cup. That is a real rare situation until this year, when we're seeing all of these upsets that have happened so far in the playoffs that have led to a Stanley Cup final here between Florida and Vegas. But I'm starting to believe more and more maybe it is just get in, because in the past, if you weren't one of the top 5 or 6 or 7 place teams overall in the league, you didn't win a Stanley Cup, even though you got into the playoffs and maybe won a round or so. But now it seems the underdogs are, maybe the game is a lot more closer than it had been at any other time in the history of the game. But these certainly the expectation level now, just get in and you do have a chance. You see what these teams have done so far this year to get themselves to the final. Vegas, not so much. They were the top team in their division. But, what the Florida Panthers have done, the teams they've knocked off to get there, has been really, really incredible. I mean, this team finished with less points than the Flames.
Yep.
They had 92 points. The Flames had 93. The Flames are not in the playoffs. The Panthers are in the playoffs, and not only in the playoffs, they're in the Stanley Cup final. So I'm going to put more into that being a possibility, just get in.
Well, to me, part of that equation now, Pete, is a guy who's done nothing all year can still find it. And Alex Lyons was the reason that the Florida Panthers got in. He came in and bailed out their season and put him on his back. And, this unheralded American Hockey League goalie got them there. And then he gets shelled at some point, and they give the net back to Bobrovsky, and he looks like the guy that you signed for $10 million.
Right? Yeah. Just absolutely incredible. I mean, everybody in the league had pretty much given up on Bobrovsky, figuring he can't, he's way, way, way overpaid. He's never going to be worth the value that you're paying him. And all of a sudden he refines his game, and he's got the team in the Stanley Cup finals after not even being the goalie when the playoffs got started. So it's just absolutely an incredible story. No question about that. So
and I think you need a little bit of what Matt Tkachuk brings to the lineup. And that's that, that kind of shift disturber, but just everything, all the intangibles that you talk about. He had them during the season. He just couldn't do it by himself for 82 games, but now he's just come to a different level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when he was with the Flames, he was my favorite player. When I was a Flames broadcaster, I never had a favorite player. I didn't feel that was proper to have a favorite player. But since I become a fan of the team, Matthew Tkachuk, when he was here, was my favorite Flame player. I mean, what he was doing out on the ice, his agitation, his hard work, and then paying off with the great attributes to get things done, getting some scoring and getting points and goals and that sort of thing. and he goes to Florida in his first season there with a whole bunch of new teammates. He has himself a career year, better than anything close to what he had here, and that has continued right on now into the playoffs. And he's been such a dominant feature with the Florida Panthers. I would say right now, if they were voting for the winner of the playoff MVP, that it would either be him or Bobrovsky. And we'll see how the finals go to see how that all pans out. But those two guys certainly have been the big reason why the Panthers have gotten themselves to where they are. They've now had themselves 12 days off before they're going to play their first game. Now, some might say that's a little bit too much, and perhaps it is. But they were a team that I think the way they play needed a little bit of a break. Maybe not 12 days, but they did need a bit of a break to go into the finals. And I think the fact that they're starting this final series in Vegas and on the road is a bit of a help, because if they're a bit rusty in the first game, at least they won't have lost a game at home, and they can regain themselves as it goes along. But I'm looking forward to this final to being a real dandy series between two teams that have got a lot. They've got a lot going for themselves. When you look at it, I think the better goaltender is with Florida. That's if Bobrovsky continue his outstanding play. The better defense is definitely with Vegas. They've got some real depth on defense, and both teams have some real good depth up front. So I'm looking for a great series. I think Tkachuk, of course, will be a big factor with the Panthers. But another guy, a guy with the Vegas team that has almost been as impactful as Jack Eichel.
Yes.
He's really come into his own and living up to the promise he was when he was drafted by the Buffalo Sabres, where things didn't quite work out for him. Then he had that big surgery that the Sabres wouldn't recommend that he have, or wouldn't agree to let him have it. He goes out on his own, has it. Then he comes back, and it's taken him a while. Boy, he's really been playing very well in the playoffs as well. So anyway, looking forward to a great series. As far as making a prediction, Rob, I don't know if I should make one, because I've predicted every series so far in the playoffs, and there have been 14 series. I've been right on 7 of them, and I had the wrong winner in both conference finals. So should I pick a winner now?
Sure, but do like me. Half an hour from now, you can change your mind, because that's how I go.
Okay, I'm betwixt and between. We got Tkachuk for Florida, and Vegas has more Canadian-born players on their roster than Florida does. They have 14. So I'm going to stick with the country.
Are you? Okay.
Vegas wins.
Okay. Gav, our producer's taking Vegas in 6. I'm going to go with. I have no ill will towards Matt Tkachuk. I really don't. I can understand why people. He left us and all those sort of things. That's the business. I wish the Flames could have done a better job of trying to keep him, and I think the building will help and all of those sort of things. But he's hard not to like. I got to know him a little bit. I was around him a little bit. And I don't know, I've been put off by Vegas a little bit that they had such success coming in, and now you have to listen to all of these stats about, how successful they've been, how many, finals they've been to already, how many semifinals they've been in, everything. They stacked the deck for that team like no other team has been stacked. Even Seattle didn't have the opportunities coming into the league that Bill Foley's team did.
Right. Yep, absolutely. I mean, Gary Bettman even made that comment going back to an interview that I heard him do not all that long ago, saying that the league decided that with the amount of money that they were charging Vegas to come in and then Seattle, that they were going to allow it to have better players for them to select from when they're taking players off opposing teams. Teams will only be able to throw 10 players each team could protect in the last 2 expansion drafts. So you were 9 players, I think it was. So you were getting the 10th best player on all of these teams, and that had helped make these teams successful so quickly. Although I was quite surprised that Vegas was able to get to the final so quickly when they did the first time, and Seattle doing it again. But they got some good quality players in there, and they had themselves a very good run this season. But that was a good mark on the part of the ownership to allow these teams to have a better opportunity to be successful, rather than be in the bottom of the league for a long period of time, where they built their team to contending fashion.
No, and it's a good. I think it was the right move. Don't get me wrong. I think it was the right move. I just don't. I'm just not empathetic to, Florida. When Rhett played for Florida 3 years in, that was a story, right? John Van Beesbrook and the Rats and all of that. That was a story. Vegas.
Did you know that Rat thing started with the Flames?
Did it start with the Flames?
Yeah, the Flames were playing in Florida.
Yeah.
And before the game, Scott Mellenby killed a rat in the dressing room.
Right.
He then went out and scored 2 goals in that game against the Flames. And ever since that, they called that the Scott Mellenby hat trick. And that's how the Rat Pack, or Rat, whatever they call it, became famous in Florida. That was in the old building where in Miami, where they played the game in a very rough part of town. And that started a night where they beat the Flames, and Scott Mellenby killed a rat in the dressing room with his hockey stick, then went out and scored a couple of goals. So they got the hat trick, won the game, and then the Rats followed on the ice as they had that great run in the playoffs that year. And now it's back again in the mode all these years later in a much, much better building. And also now they're getting sellout crowds. I mean, I remember watching some of their games this season. When you watch them on television, you look at the empty seats that were in the stands are incredible for an NHL team that had done so well, especially last year when they finished #1 overall. But, they brought hockey, finally made it something that's popular in South Florida, where prior to that, only Tampa was the one that was getting great, great hockey excitement. But now it's also spread to the other side of the coast.
No, and let's not throw stones at glass houses, Pete, because when I arrived in 2003, 2004, there were some, gloomy nights and Tuesdays in the fall and stuff like that. The crowds weren't much better here either, right? So
you're right.
Give them a winner.
Yes, Rob, I can remember nights there when we were in that run where the Flames had gone 7 straight years with no playoffs. There weren't 7,000 people in the building. The upper area there where we were, there was nobody. And, things weren't looking very good for the same hockey team at the time.
And the same in Edmonton, too.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Edmonton had a downtime also. You're right. Yep. Yeah. Both of those cities had great success for a while. And then when things went a little bit flat, their attendance went way down. And both of them have been able to recover sufficiently, quite greatly, actually. The Flames really have been having close to sellout crowds ever since they had that playoff run in 2004, which to me, and I think we've talked about it here before, is that I really believe that saved the franchise.
Yes,
because if that team hadn't made the playoffs that year, it would have been 8 years in a row, no playoffs. And then there was no hockey the year after that because the players were all locked out for the 04-05 season. And then when they came back for the 05-06 campaign, the Saddledome was full of people. But that, I don't think, been the case if there had been 9 straight years of no playoff hockey here in Calgary. So
No, I agree with you.
And now we've got a new arena.
Now yes, we do. Yes, that's what I understand. So next year, when does it open, Pete? Do we have a timetable?
I don't think they can build it that fast, but it would be nice if they could put the shovel in the ground today and start going. But they've got a bunch of things that have to get worked out behind the scenes. But we were a little bit concerned going into the election on Monday that if the NDP had emerged as the power, that this thing might have to go through a re-examination. But the fact that Daniel Smith and the UPC have now the majority, they'll start working now on getting that going. Some of the information seems to indicate that they'll start probably in after the Stampede in 2024. So that's not this summer, but the following summer. So we're still a while before we're going to see this team in the building. It's probably going to take, I would guess, 3 years to build the building. And so we're a little way down the road, but at least now we've got an opening that the building is pretty much on its way, and look forward to having that all get rounded out and the shovels go in the ground, and we can, once they get the new one in there, it'll be a much, much better scene for fans to go to watch the game, and better for the players that are involved there, and to be in more update facilities.
Agreed. You'll excuse me if I'm just a little nervous until we see shovels.
Yes, because we were at this point once before.
Yes, we have been. We have been. Before I let you go, the Flames, what do we got this date in Flames history?
Well, this time now, going back, it's May 31st. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about May 29th and May 31st. So this, of course, was in that 2004 playoff run that the Flames had. And it was on the 29th of May that the Flames won Game 3 of that series against Tampa. That game was in the Saddle Dome, and a big 3-0 victory for the Flames to gain 2-1 lead in the series. Mika Kiprasov stopped 21 shots to get the shutout, his 5th shutout of the playoffs, and that would be his last playoff shutout of that run. Chris Simon and Jerome McGinley both had a goal and an assist in that game, but that was also the night that Jerome McGinley and Vincent Lecavalier engaged in that fight that gained an awful lot of attention around the NHL when those two top players had that fight. Now, then we go to May 31st, which is 2004 on this night, and that is another game that was played in the Saddle Dome, and Tampa won that game 1-0 to tie the series at 2-2. Brad Richards scoring the only goal. That was a power play goal that came early in the game, 2 minutes and 48 seconds into the first period. Brad Richards scored that goal, and the Flames couldn't get one by Nikolai Habibulin, who stopped 29 shots for that shutout. And then Mika Kiprasov stopped 27 shots in the Flame net, allowing just the one goal. And, of course, series then would go to Tampa for Game 3, and the Flames would win that one 3-2 in overtime and take a 3-2 lead in the series. That was also the 10th road game the Flames won on that playoff run, which tied an NHL record that still stands. They're tied with the New Jersey Devils, who did that prior to that. And then, of course, we had the infamous game here at the Saddle Dome on June the 5th when the Panthers won in double overtime, the Lightning scored in double overtime to steal that game from the Flames, I guess the best way to put it, because Marty Jelena actually scored a goal for the Flames with about 8 minutes left to go in the third period, but they didn't have the video review that we have now, so it was determined that the puck had not gone across the line, although since then we've seen pictures of the puck across the goal line. So anyway, Tampa won that game, and then it would send the series to Game 7, and that one was a 2-1 victory for the Lightning, and they captured the Canada Cup in Tampa on June the 7th. Flames got behind in that game 2-0, and then the current general manager of the Flames, Craig Conroy, scored a power play goal at 9:21 of the third period, getting the Flames back to within one, and they made it a battle. They had a brief power play in the closing couple of minutes there, but they couldn't get the tying goal, and Tampa won the Stanley Cup. So that was all the case in 2004.
I want to rewind just a little bit to that 1-0 loss to Tampa. Pete, that was the Kerry Fraser call?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Was that a 5-on-3 goal?
I think it was a 5-on-4.
Okay.
I'd have to go back and check that. I should have checked that.
But remember, everybody lost their mind about Kerry Fraser.
Yes, right? And that's why Kerry Fraser. Wait, now let me get this right.
Was he not?
He was supposed to be the referee of Game 6.
Yeah,
that's right. He was supposed to be the referee in Game 6, and the league said no, it's better not because of the incidents that happened in Game 4. You're right. That may have been a 5-on-3. I should have checked that closer. I'm sorry.
Oh yes, please apologize for not having the information on something 20 years ago that I could completely be wrong on.
I'll check. I'll send you a text after this is done.
All right, send me a text. And before I let you go, what do you think? Brad and Craig hook up, big deal. You know, maybe Calgary can fleece Toronto. Maybe, you know, fair is fair. Go back and revisit history a bit.
Yes, we are deserving of having a fair, being the winner of a trade between those two teams. Going back to 92 when Cliff Fletcher, who had been the Flames' general manager, left here to be the general manager in Toronto, just as Brad Treliving has done now, except Brad didn't get a Stanley Cup here, which Cliff did in 1989. And, of course, that big 10-player trade, one of the biggest trades in NHL history, was made, and it ended up with the Flames not getting very much positive in that exchange. They, of course, gave up Doug Gilmour and Jamie McCowan and Rick Walmsley and Rick Natras in that trade, and ended up getting the best player they got back in that trade was Gary Lehman. And he didn't turn out too well as a member of the Flames, although later he would go on and win a Stanley Cup with the Montreal Canadiens. So, sure. Yeah, that was you know, a lot of people say that Cliff Fletcher picked the Flames' pockets on that particular trade, but it was a situation where Doug Gilmour was going to be traded. He had a run-in with the Flames' then general manager, Doug Risebrough, over a contract thing. And the thing with Doug, when Doug Risebrough was the GM of the Flames, he was like he played. Everything was a confrontation. And he and Gilmore got themselves into a big confrontation with regard to his contract. And then it got to a point where they said he's going to be traded. He's got to be traded. So he got traded. And what was really interesting is that Cliff Fletcher, when he was general manager of the Flames, wanted to get Gary Leeman for the Flames. Couldn't get a trade pulled off. He goes to Toronto, and he's there a limited amount of time, and he wants to trade Gary Leeman. So that should have told the people in the Flames office, so some of those were in his office when Cliff was here, that maybe there was an issue with Gary Leeman. And it turned out he wasn't the good player that they were thinking they were getting in that transaction. And some of the other players they got there have escaped my mind. And some of them never got to play in the NHL.
As they should. As they should. Great to catch up, Pete. Lots of good stuff there. Obviously, we wait to hear from Brad Treliving tomorrow. He'll speak to the media about his new job in Toronto, and eagerly awaiting some of Craig's first decisions so that people can judge what kind of GM he's going to be. Right? That's what
There's going to be a lot to talk about. There's no question about that.
Yep.
No doubt. The summer is not going to be quiet from a hockey standpoint.
Never is around here. Good to see you, my friend. Thanks for doing this.
All right. You take care, Rob. Chat later.
Peter Maher, everybody, the legend, the Hall of Fame, 7 Hall of Fames, I believe.